development is obviously not new to you, right? Uh, why am I calling it violent? Right? We all know this as a scheme which actually came into being in 1991 as a win-win solution for all stakeholders involved, right? So it was something which would benefit the market. It would create something for the more than 50% population who stayed in slums. It would also perhaps release land for open spaces or the so-called developmental projects for which land had been reserved and which, because of the encroachments by slums, couldn't be utilized for that development, right? So really a win-win-win solution. I am, however, going to argue that slum redevelopment is not just violent, but today, when we look at slum redevelopment today, it is a regime and it is not just a scheme. And that implies a very, very different set of parameters by which you look at what is happening in the city. I just like this small poem very, very much. The headlong stream is termed violent, but the riverbed which hems it in is not termed violent by anyone. The storm that bends the birch trees is held to be violent. But how about the storm that bends the back of road workers? Okay. So we really need to think of violence also in multiple ways. Okay. So violence is not just the physical violences that all of us see. It is also not just mental abuse. Okay. But the way in which one looks at structural violence is a way in which agency, voice, freedoms are basically constrained and they get shrunk over a period of time. So 20 years, I really don't know whether to call it even 20 years. It's now, if we start counting slum redevelopment from 1991, then it is 22 years, right? 32 years, right? If you start counting it as slum rehabilitation scheme classical, that's from 1997 onwards. So a little lesser than that 32, right? And it has constantly been regarded as a development scheme. Whenever I have seen literature also on the slum redevelopment scheme, it gets evaluated as a scheme. Okay? So what is the entitlement, which has gone on changing constantly? So beginning with 225 square feet of free area to every eligible household whose names are there in the 1995 electoral list, and occupying a structure in a recognized slum. Now, to date, nobody pays much attention to that second part, and which actually makes many, many people ineligible. And a goalpost which was set was around 400,000 households in the city to be covered. Okay. So this is something that one needs to also keep in mind if one is looking at what has been achieved, what has been done, so on. So the spatial incentives given at the beginning of the scheme, it was 2.5 FSI. And this subsequently, we saw that the 1997 scheme formulation actually talked about much more flexible FSI in what it called as difficult areas. And then the 1997 scheme also gave the freedom to link it to TDR, which flexibilized the use of this incentive. And we have a new institution which is called the Slum Rehabilitation Authority, which today perhaps I think it's very interesting. When I started engaging with the slum rehabilitation scheme, do you know where its office was? Anybody knows here? Its office was like this size of a room in the Mada building, 5th floor. Today, anybody knows where the office of the SRA is? It's on the Anand Kanekar Marg. It's a separate building and one which has been constructed by HDI. So I think it's a new institution giving a one window approach for approvals, supposed to be this facilitator. this connector between the market and the people and the state, right? So I think there are many, many new elements that SRA, slum redevelopment, actually introduced, right? So what's problem? There's no problem in any of this. But so if you look at even slum redevelopment in literature, I've just put together, I'm not looking here, there, nowhere outside of India, though outside India also, there have been a fair bit of experiments around what are called inclusive housing schemes using different formats of public-private partnerships. Okay? So this is just about the SRS scheme in Mumbai. Okay? So Anand and Rademacher ask us, while acknowledging that there are complexities and difficulties in the achievement, they say that the SRS is a achievement of several housing struggles. And it is because of these housing struggles that you are seeing this, that in no other city in India do slum dwellers are entitled to get a free house. And here this entitlement of a house is something which has been accepted. In the same hopeful way, one can also look at Mr. Purra, who talks about this as a huge win for collectives of informal settlements in the context of continued uncertainties. On the other hand, you have Nijman, who has not even looked at the empirical context, but just reviewing the terms of the scheme. He basically says this is a model of neoliberal urbanism in Mumbai. And you have Desai and Loftus in 2013, who call it speculative urbanism, which gives rise to more and more rentiering within informal settlements, and it increases the vulnerability, especially of women and elders. And you have Sanyal and Mukhija writing much earlier, but a very, very careful and a very detailed study of a transition from conventional slum development models to then it taking the PPP form. And they just say that they are commenting on how this is a very, very complex scenario and how the roles of actors are shifting. Okay? So this is what exists in the literature so far. If you look at it carefully, all of this is still regarding this as a scheme. Okay? Scheme introduced in a particular era, perhaps neoliberalism, perhaps linked to public-private partnerships, but and giving rise to some amount of speculation, but nonetheless a scheme intended to do good. So my argument, you can no longer regard it as a scheme, it is a regime. Why do I say this? I'm going to kind of go through this. It was difficult for me to present a chart in one slide. So you're going to see a continuation of about 3-4 slides, just talking about how I established that this has become a regime. So I call the phase of 1991 to 1997. 1991, when slum redevelopment, it was introduced as slum redevelopment scheme. It was called SRD then. And very interestingly, at that time, it was a scheme under the Mumbai Municipal Corporation. The Mumbai Municipal Corporation had a committee which would approve proposals of slum redevelopment. At that time, settlers had to pay 15,000 rupees if they were to be participants in a scheme. There was an emphasis on inclusion of all households, often, including the renters. And you will also see that there have been quite a few designs, like if you look at some of the park experiments or SRS experiments, Slum Rehabilitation Society was another NGO, or another NGO called People's Participation Program. And all of these try to encourage people's participation in the design of these new habitats. So essentially, this is an experimentation scheme. What were they trying to experiment with? I think two things. Number one, is there an appetite among informal settlers to live in vertical buildings? Okay? Because till that time, most even development of settlements was largely either in the form of sites which were given or maximum it would be like ground plus 2. Like if you see Siddharth Colony in Bandra East, it is one of the examples of early redevelopment, but it's barely 1 plus 2 kind of a thing. So this is really the experimental ground. Once that in these experiments, both as financiers, okay, etc. Okay. And clearly the frontier was played by several NGOs. And so this, I think, is interesting. Huh? Today, if any of you are following developments of what is happening in Ahmedabad as well, currently you see a phase where NGOs are very much at the frontier of slum redevelopment experiments. So there is something interesting to see and follow really through. The 1997 is the time when the Shiv Sena government came into power with the assurance of creating and giving free houses to 40,000 slum dwellers within a span of 5 years. 40 lakhs, sorry, 40 lakhs slum dwellers. And it took the form of free housing. Okay. It is interesting to read the Afzalpur committee report, which gave these recommendations. And there are two which are very important. Number one, Afzalpur committee did not see this necessarily as free housing. Okay. Though it translated into no monetary contribution, there are clear statements within the Afzalpur committee report which acknowledge that there is a lot of effort, there is a lot of investment, including monetary investment, which has gone into creation of the informal settlement itself. Okay? So what happens in redevelopment? You're first going to demolish that. So there is, let's say, a lack of investment or even more which has gone on over a period of several years, which is then raised to ground. And then you are replacing that with something else, right? So not necessarily this is free housing. Okay. So this is actually in lieu of something else. And that recognition is there within the Afzalpur committee report, but perhaps much more in language terms. Okay. There are other things that it however said, which began, you can see how the agency begins to shrink, how the voice begins to shrink. The first, instead of a collective consent, which was a must in previous schemes, taking off from the tradition where it said that 70% of the community has to say yes. Now it took the form of individual households have to say yes. Okay, they have to sign an affidavit saying that you agree to participate in this scheme. And a collation of these kind of 70% individual households, that is what is participation. Okay, and participation then is only limited to this consent. What gets presented at the consent level, etc., that is not the consideration of the approving authority at all. Okay, so this is just important to note. Next, previously, cooperative societies of the informal settlers were a must. Okay. Now, they said it is too difficult to form cooperative societies previously, so it is okay if promoters take a lead. Okay. And so you do not have a collective voice anymore. Okay. So again, this is important to note. The next step. This is not at the beginning of the Afzalpur committee report, but gradually it started happening that around 2000, especially there was a GR. And then in practice, consent of ineligible households was not valid. So how do you calculate? So you first do a round of eligibility testing. Okay. Then consent is taken only of eligible dwellers. Okay. And that consent gets counted. Now here is where a whole lot of manipulation actually begins to happen. I have seen so many cases where there is tremendous intimidation and all kinds of manipulation to prove people ineligible. So if there are opponents of a scheme, you put all kinds of cases on them, okay, including criminal cases. Okay. And with that kind of threat of violence, either people are intimidating into acquiescing and becoming part of the scheme, or they just move out. Okay. Now, I think these are important facets to understand about when we say something, what actually happens on the ground. The other thing was slum redevelopment now became a law. In 2001, the, this slum redevelopment scheme became part of the entire slum law itself. Now, what did that do? Previously, the entire regulation linked to slums read as slums, declaration, improvement, redevelopment, development law of 1971. Okay. Now, all improvement, development became equivalent to redevelopment. There is no option. Okay. There is only one option which is afforded to people in Mumbai. Remember, the slum law is valid throughout the state of Maharashtra. Okay? But in Mumbai, especially, you do not now have any other scheme which is possible. So if you have to think about developing your settlement, you can only think about doing it through a redevelopment mode. There can be no upgradation which is possible. There can be no other models of improvement that are possible. Okay, just think about that. Then the next thing which also became very important was key for many developers, everyone. It is because now cooperative society was not necessary. It basically became a scheme where the proponents were different slum leaders. And so began a phase of dynamics between different slum leaders. I represent this constituency, I represent that end of the slum, something else. And there is an intense competition to see who gets a developer, what are the favors that I can curry with the developer, and so on and so forth. So you can understand how this formulation begins to create a newer dynamic in the city. So this is the second phase, which I call as laying the foundations of the regime. But the regime actually takes shape in the new millennium from 2002 onwards. Why do I say this? This is a period where there were two things which happened. Number one, that the entire force of the slum redevelopment scheme, and I know all of you are very, very young, but still think of a time where real estate markets were not very prevalent in the city. Not just that, but slum territories, okay, were present both in market areas and especially when you go towards the suburbs, okay, Jogeshwari, Andheri, Chembur, Mulund, Dahisar, you will see all of these suburbs having very, very large slums, very few road connectivities, and therefore slum redevelopment schemes being feasible for developers only in areas around the stations or along major roads. But what happened in 2001? A big breakthrough for all slum redevelopment schemes by the World Bank projects, where two things began to happen. Number one, there were many more road links which were created and which penetrated through slums. So even previous slums and settlements which were considered unfeasible by developers, okay, now started becoming feasible for developers. A classic example is the Jogeshwari Vikhroli link road. So you see, if first there is a cut which is made, and then there are people who are resettled by the World Bank program. And then that is followed by a huge range of slum redevelopment schemes all along that route. Okay? So something which was considered impenetrable now became very clearly market feasible. Okay? I would say the same thing, okay, right before resettlement colonies came to the MES ward, there were only 2 SRS schemes in MES ward and they were stuck forever. Okay? But after the resettlement program, it is a different thing altogether. Okay, so resettlement colonies came up and they opened up the land for newer developers to come in. Okay, so this is, I think, a very, very important thing. And then simultaneously, a eligibility was revised on one note. Okay, so it said now instead of 1995 occupancy before 2001, but the conditions for proving that eligibility became much more complex. Why? Because you have to be and you have to show you are there in the city since 2001. But you have to show continuous stay in a hutment which has been surveyed in 1976. Then you are eligible. Okay? It was not like the World Bank resettlement program where at the time of resettlement, there is a survey done and all structures are mapped and marked. So this is like structures are predated, occupants, you are revising the eligibility, which means that there would have been all kinds of transactions and there are several transactions which are then pushed into the background as ineligible transactions. The second thing which was very interesting, now the geographies of redevelopment started becoming larger and larger. Mergers of schemes. So the first few in 2003, 2001, we completed the study in 2003. In 2001, we were commissioned by the Slum Rehabilitation Authority to do a study of the utilization of slum rehabilitation scheme in Mumbai. And the schemes that we saw then were really chutuputtu schemes, I would say, if you start looking at them today. Okay, so like 6, 7 story buildings. Okay, today many of them, if you visit them, and I did have a few photos, but I didn't include them deliberately in this presentation. But you will really see that the scale of the scheme was even less than half a settlement often. They did not even cover the full settlement. Okay? But now there were larger and larger schemes which combined 2 or 3 settlements. So, like for example, one of the first slum rehabilitation schemes on the western suburbs was that of Prem Nagar in Jogeshwari. And Prem Nagar had about 3 or 4 different SRS schemes. Okay? They didn't work out finally. I'm just telling you that there were 4 developers. Subsequently, they started merging. Okay? Now, this merger of schemes, acquisition of schemes, now this is a new dynamic. And it created, again, lots of resistances, but which were all kind of mowed down in a way, because it was, I mean, I will tell you what were the decisions taken subsequently by the Slum Rehabilitation Authority. But I just want to say here, when the scale of redevelopment increases, just think about it. If all of you are staying in formal buildings, even in a cooperative society where there are 20, 25 people, there is some amount of ownership that you may have. You may participate in the meetings. The more the scale of that begins to increase, it becomes more difficult to participate. Okay? So just think about this, when the size of a slum redevelopment scheme begins to assume proportions such as 3,000 households, 4,000 households, it becomes extremely difficult to even understand what is happening, what is going to be the progress of things, and who begins to actually take the decisions and how, and what are the rules which are under which these decisions are being made. There were several decisions and contestations here, but which were all disapproved. So in the case of Godibar, which is one of the most famous ones, there were about 15 different SRS schemes which were merged into one big SRA scheme. There were several protests by not all the participating societies, but by a few of the societies, and all of these were considered invalid. They were considered invalid basically because you're getting a benefit of a rehabilitation tenement anyway. You are getting a free tenement. So what are you complaining? इससे मिला या उससे मिला? Problem क्या है आपको? Okay. So it's like maybe a college saying कि you are being taught a subject now, so sit quiet. The teacher is something that we will decide, right? So you don't have a right to decide the teacher. It's like the same. Okay. You also see that in all of these mergers, see, consent is a ratio. They talk about 70% of people participate. Okay. Now, how is 70% calculated? You have to have 100% to calculate the 70%. Okay. So suppose we calculate 70% of this particular rule. It will give you a particular number. But now, when the developer considers this entire area as your 100%, your 70% is going to become a minority gradually in a large scale. Okay. So you begin to understand then how consent ratios also start becoming more and more manipulated. In fact, I am aware of in Golibar, there were things like the people. So you have signed up for a particular developer, this particular 4 rows here. Okay. And the developer is changed. Okay. And you say, no, I'm not signed up for a developer. So then there are people who will visit your house and tell you, if you don't sign up, you will not even get a house because you see, they have signed, they have signed, they have signed, they have signed. You will become a minority and you will not get any house whatsoever. So what happens? You acquiesce and you also sign onto the documents. Okay. Interestingly, there were several areas which were declared as a slums, and so now there is a new thing which gets added, right? So the Slum Act allowed for declaration of areas as slums. Okay, so there are lists of slums which are then published in the gazetteer by the collector. That is the process of declaration of a slum. And having declared a slum, then the government is obligated to place and provide basic services to the area. Okay. Now you will see that after 2000, there are very, very few slums which have been actually declared. No declaration of slums. So you can begin to see what are the things which are happening. And now, post 2010, you will actually see that the regime is in its full form. So if you look at the Mumbai Development Plan, it's very interesting to see that it is only redevelopment which is seen as the strategy for the future. Interestingly, even other national housing policies which have come, which have some other prospects, alternative prospects for development. Like if you think about Rajiv Awas Yojana, which talked of giving property rights to slum dwellers, not implemented in Mumbai. If you look at Panta Pradhan Awas Yojana, the current housing scheme, which has 4 different verticals. Affordable housing in partnership is just one of these verticals. There is credit link subsidy. There is now also rental housing for migrants. There is a third scheme, which is in situ redevelopment and development as well. None of these are even allowed to be operationalized in the geographical jurisdiction of Mumbai. Okay. So this is something which one has to note. In terms of consent guidelines, now consent is brought down to 50%. Not just that, but the clear understanding now is that people consent to being part of redevelopment, not to a developer. So you can opt out of redevelopment and then you will be completely denied the benefits of redevelopment. But At the same time, it is not possible that you can say that this developer is not good or the plans that are being shown to me are not good. Shall we hold on to another plan? Can we make other suggestions? That is something which is not possible in the current framework at all. Plus, if you look at now the revisions within FAR, etc., are compelling extremely high intensity redevelopments. So the 7 manzila buildings which I was talking about now are clearly a thing of the past. And all new redevelopments are like 30, 40 stories high, with their own implications of what they would mean for the livelihoods, for the even the ability to hold on to the tenant, right? Because you have to have a paying capacity to live in such a high maintenance tenement. Okay, so think about it. So now I'll come to the last part, which is actually talking about why is this violent? We saw that there is agency which is shrinking. We saw that the conditions are rife for voice which is shrinking. But so one of the most important things that I feel is the entire justification of why slum rehabilitation scheme is basically linked to participation of people, and which is why they have had different consent conditions right from the beginning. And this kind of participation theoretically can be said to basically this form protects the interests of people. Ensures that there is some voice which is expressed, some choice which is expressed. But how you begin to see a dilution in that and an active manipulation of that by limiting it only to eligibles, the huge amounts of intimidation, manipulation which happened. And I can share with you, I was part of a People's Commission to investigate cases of irregularities in SRM. These are all about 7, 8 schemes we studied in detail, which were happening in the entire period between 2007 to 2010. And fantastic things. I can just give you some examples. In Sion Kodivada, okay, there are dead people whose names are there in the list of eligibles, and they have also signed consent. Okay, they were not dead after signing the consent. So, there were people who don't even stay in the colony, and kahan se naam aaye hain malum nahi. Okay. There are lists again in another case in Vikhroli, Ganesh Nagar. Okay. And there the story is interesting because in Vikhroli, Parkside, there are a lot of slum upgradation societies, which are small societies, 100, 150 households, all small barrack kind of a things, but they were still cooperative societies, many of which also had been given lease by MHADA as part of the World Bank program in the 1980s. Okay? But they were several of the chores were clearly intimidated into signing the consent documents. So the developer would take consent from a chawl which is located either below or on the upper side, okay, leaving the chawl which is not signed intact. So their houses are technically intact. He's not touched them. Then they would start drilling work. Okay, drilling work to such an extent these houses would develop cracks. Their access to the rest of the locality itself would become extremely difficult. Getting in and out of the house used to be dangerous. Okay, so a different strategy altogether. In Jogeshwari, another interesting case where what the developer did was there were about 600 people who were eligible. Okay? 150 people, he said, there is not enough space in the transit camp that I'm building, so I will give you all rent. Okay? So around 150 people or so were given rent. And he was paying regularly for about 4 months. After that, stopped giving rent. Okay? And all the people are coming to his office every time. He said, आप जाके SRA ऑफिस में पूछो. क्या पूछे? SRA ऑफिस में जाके पूछेंगे तो हम क्या डेवलपर के पीछे पड़ने के लिए हम ऑफिस में बैठे हैं क्या? तो exact, I think these are very interesting, and all of these 150 people had also given their consent. Huh? Just mind you. So it is just that it was going to be difficult for him to accommodate. So all of them are given rent. So in some ways, out of sight, out of mind. No? So all of these are things which were happening with respect to the consent itself. I'm going to come to another point, and which is really talking about what is a settlement. Okay? And I believe that in a city like Mumbai, slums are really the footholds of the poor, through which then other claims are expanded in the city. If you look at the city as a place which only respects the rule of property, okay, then you also have slums where people, through their labor, are making the city. Okay. Whether and extremely unfriendly sites. So I can tell you stories of whether in Dharavi or whether in several communities in East Ward, what are the efforts that have gone into making a settlement, and how many years have gone into it, and also what are the struggles that people have faced in order to also do that. Okay? The toll that it has taken on their bodies, on their expenses, all of them. Okay? So, and in many ways, like I have also heard stories, and this is interesting, that when it is not as if slums were totally unconnected from the property market. Okay? I am not such a romantic where one can see that slum, matlab, everything great is happening there. But I will tell you that there are in every settlement, there are at least a handful of people who have come to be there, not by payment of money, okay, but because, let's say, like one interesting story in a settlement in Chembur, a deserted woman with 3 young children, okay, has nowhere to go, has been turned out of her husband's family home, and is prepared to work but has nowhere to go. Goes to the nearby bhai, and the bhai says, "Wo wahan pe tum bana do." Okay? So what she is able to afford? She is able to afford 1 or 2 gonies of debris. She fills that in, and it is exactly that much amount of space that she occupies. She does not even have the capacity to occupy more. Okay? There is no payment involved. Are you getting this? Now, of course, you will also ask me the legality of this. Zameen kiski hai, kya hai? But I will also talk you, and I think there are equally interesting stories of how the legally propertied are not so legally propertied at all, right? So there is a lot of contestation around that as well. Okay? What SRS did? The SRS has changed these dynamics completely, even within informal settlements. Whatever was this thin space, which was like a non-commodified, non-property space within informal settlements, even that today has become a space of speculation. Okay? In the East Ward, we run study centers. In settlements where there is no legal water, there is no legal electricity, and the rent that we pay for a 15 by 20 room is a 10,000 rupees per month. Okay, I'm not giving this as a exaggeration, but just to point out to you how the dynamics of speculation take root in settlements where otherwise they should be so remote from property. They would at least be affordable spaces, if not non-commodified spaces. So just think about that. What it also does is it makes slums exclusive. I will argue with you that the increase in the number of homeless in the city is directly proportional to how much you make slums also exclusive. Because slums in some ways was the only affordable housing solution in the city, right? So that is another aspect of this violence that one is talking about. Second, this entire scheme, it produces almost like a acquiescence amongst all actors, including state actors. Okay, so where and I think that is really the concerning thing. Where is the voice of protest? Where is the voice of contestation? You have slum leaders who are today part of this. Okay, you have NGOs who are a part of this. You have developers who are a part of this. Any government department that you go, the collector, the police, okay, you will see the penetrations and this kind of schemes moving anywhere, everywhere. So even if one person is trying to say, hey, what is happening here is not correct, you see all of these actors who are almost acting in a nexus, then kind of clamping down upon individuals who dare to protest, who dare to ask questions. Okay, so I think this is something which is very, very critical. Okay? And what is not possible, you also have extra legal actions as well. Okay? So it is very interesting to also see there is definitely a both a legal part of the violence and there is an extra legal part of that violence as well. Tempted to go into many examples, but perhaps later. And what it does to a settlement is increasingly there are more and more internal conflicts. There is factionalization, there is co-option, and leadership is something which is bought off. In fact, one will go to the extent where earlier I've heard of youth gangs being employed. Gangs as in not gundas, huh? But these are employing youth to just keep watch. Okay? Whether there are other developers who are coming in, whether there are other moves which are being made. Okay? And if there are moves which are being made, then you take the next step. Okay? Now I have started also hearing of women bouncers. Okay? Visiting different rehabilitation tenements and also first khali karna hai. Okay? Now, how does this happen? Okay, and you begin to think of how every community formation and consolidation movement now is also being commodified. I've seen, and I have, because my background is also in social work, for long years I have worked in slum settlements where festivals used to be a matter of contribution, whether it is Buddha Jayanti or whether it is you think of even things like 15th August or Ganpati, people used to contribute. Okay? Today, it is simple. Somebody does it on your behalf. Somebody as in, and you also know who that somebody is, right? And if that somebody says no, then you also have other demands, right? कि इसने तो हमको वो ये टेम्पल वज्रेश्वरी का टेम्पल दिखाने भी गए थे और सबको एक एक साड़ी भी दे दी. So you begin to think of what this does to mobilization of communities and their sense really and consolidation that we are one. There are some struggles that all of us have to fight collectively and so on. The last, I want to move to the state part of it, and where I think that slum redevelopment regime is really a case of complete abdication by the state. It is not just in the form of how SRA behaves, okay? But to me, it is interesting to see 3-4 other things. Number one, you shift housing and you are no longer BPL. Okay, that's very interesting, right? How does a person become non-poor if one gets a formal house? Okay, your livelihoods have not shifted, right? In fact, there is an additional vulnerability which has been created. But in the entire Mumbai's case, this is something which is not considered. You think about other elements in this municipal corporation and this city, which desperately and people are thirsting for more public health options. What happens to dispensaries? What happens to welfare schemes, social security? All of these are being totally neglected. There is one option, which is housing. Housing is welfare for us. So in fact, for a long years, this is even interesting that in Mumbai we give free housing, but water, however, was not available to all settlements. For that, you had to belong to a legal settlement. Okay? ऐसा contradiction तो जग में नहीं हो सकता, right? That you have to pay for water and you can get free housing. Now, these are the contradictions of a abdicating state, really, which does not realize what are its responsibilities, what are its commitments to the people who are vulnerable. Okay. I think there are other elements of how spatial injustice is embedded into the scheme. Hussein has written, of course, about the resettlement schemes and how they produce peripheralization of every kind, right? Including producing how they produce and the conditions which are rife, where you almost produce a slum, right? So you do something in the name of rehabilitation, but you produce a slum. Okay. But when I'm trying to talk about spatial injustice, I think again interesting to note that this regime, what it has been successfully able to do is to rid most of the island city areas of settlements. And all of them now have been shifted to the northern and the suburbs, whether on the eastern side or whether on the western side, the eastern side the most. How have we produced this in a city which prided itself on a lot of spatial integration? I think this is something that we really need to understand. And what are the implications of this spatial injustice? Okay. We are also concentrating the poor in suburban areas which are thin of public services. If you will note, most of our hospitals, our public amenities are largely concentrated in the city areas. You start moving towards the suburbs, you will see that these networks get thinned out. And that is where you're pushing the people further and further apart. And these then passes on many burdens onto residents. Till less than 5 years ago, in the entire M East ward, there were only 2 municipal secondary schools. Only 2 municipal secondary schools. What are we saying here? That on one hand, we will pass laws like right to education. And on the other hand, children have no option to study beyond 5th standard. How we produce exclusion of many people. Here nothing is happening. Okay. Is it timed? Okay, anyway, there are just 3-4 points which I can just, anyway, it's text based, so I can always talk about it. So the first is that you will see I really believe that there have to be multiple systems that contest the rule of property, because the rule of property is an extremely hegemonic rule. And the way we are doing this is perhaps even more hegemonic because there are many more controls which are applied over it. And what we are doing, because the minute slum redevelopment becomes a regime, you now have the courts, you have the bureaucratic agencies, all of them believing only in this. There is also alienation which is produced. Just think of it. Today, the entire middle class is totally non-sympathetic to slum dwellers. And one of the reasons is कि हम लोग इतना कष्ट करेंगे और बहुत दूर रहेंगे. And look at the slum dwellers. They have to just occupy and they will get a free house. Okay. So this free house discourse is a very alienating discourse. It is not true, firstly, But more importantly, it is a very alienating discourse. And this produces even judgments which are very cruel. How courts treat this in multiple jurisprudences, whether it is linked to consent, whether it is linked to complaints, linked to different officials, uh, how the terms of filing PILs have been changed. There is, I think, this is the city in which we passed of very landmark judgment in the 1980s about right to housing, recognizing rights of livelihood and right of housing as both being linked to the right to life. And today, in this very city, we are saying that there is no right to housing. What exists is a right to a house, the way we say it. Okay? And a right to housing is very different from a right to a house. So finally, I would just say, you just think of the multiple exclusions which are occurring. So I just received some figures. So in Dharavi redevelopment, uh, you have about 50,000 people who are ineligible. Eligible, sorry, rounding up. There are going to be 7 lakh people who are ineligible and who are to be given different kinds of transit or rental accommodations all over the city. Just look at the proportion, 50,000 to 7 lakh. Now for those 50,000, you will increase the area of the house. Okay. What will you do for the 7 lakh? Now nobody is raising question as to this at all. Why don't we raise questions? Because for us, I say, and that really is the violence, right? That today all of us are quiet, that there is nobody who is protesting or even cognizing the entire way in which we've produced a acquiescence over a scheme which is extremely violent in the kind of impacts that it is producing for the vulnerable of the city. Thank you.
For the wonderful session, Dr. Dhire. I would now like to call upon Shantanu to discuss the question. Sorry, Hussain.
Okay.
So sorry.
Um, Thank you so much, Anita, for this talk. I 14 years now, I think, and heard you so many times. But what's amazing is every time you speak, one gets to learn something new, something different. Maybe not just in terms of new information, but also new perspective. And this was, I mean, just another new learning experience. It's wonderful. What was very interesting was this distinction that you spoke about between a scheme and a regime. And obviously, I mean, knowing you, your work is extremely empirical, and the theory is informed by experience. The theory doesn't come prior to experience, which is what makes it so insightful as well. So when you say regime and not scheme, it's not to be taken lightly. There's a lot of weight behind those words. So it'd be interesting to think about that, and if you can expand a little more on it. But also, I mean, what I was thinking when you were speaking was, yes, we can think about slum redevelopment as a regime. but we can also think about slum, the slum redevelopment as a part of a redevelopment regime in the city. Because almost all development now is redevelopment. In the development plan, all of the schemes which developers find interest in are redevelopment schemes. There is no other, even greenfield sites are now thought about in that mode. So if you can expand on that a little, that'd be great.
Thanks for catching that as well. So if one looks at, I'll go a little bit into regime theories itself. Regime theories are largely come from US-based literature, and they basically look at, I would say, nexuses in some ways, and nexuses of different elements of power. With lots of interconnections between actors, institutions, processes. And when I particularly look at slum development, I definitely think that the entire nexus that it has produced, because it is today not just confined between the housing department or the UD department and developers and SRA and particular settlements, okay? But it is something which stretches local police stations, higher police stations, political parties, again, at all levels. Then bureaucrats and all kind of bureaucratic offices, not just housing, okay? So you have collector departments, and then you have the same electricity, even the private electricity operators getting involved in this, how connections are cut and so on and so forth. And there are then the extra legal acts. So when all of that kind of comes together, it is like as strong as a Molotov cocktail, literally. And it is this force which is getting unleashed onto settlements. And I think that is something that one has to really perhaps think about. And that is not recognized. I don't think that receives much visibility in international literature, but also in basic literature, I would say. No, it's like we all pretend to see it as a development scheme. That how choices of people are actually getting so diminished. Okay. I see this, yes, it is linked to the larger redevelopment regime, but and whether that larger thing can be called as a regime, I don't know, because it is definitely a culture, much larger culture. And why I'm using these terms very specifically is that it is the overall politics and the overall contours in other redevelopment schemes versus slum redevelopment schemes, which makes a whole difference. For example, in most middle class, upper middle class, or even elite areas where redevelopment is being practiced, one goes into it with a sense of entitlement. Okay? And that I have this, I want this much more. You do not see this because in SRA, you have the state which has determined the entitlement. The expansion of that entitlement is only when you are able to politicize it to the extent that perhaps Dharavi has been able to do, or because of the prestigiousness or the scale of that project. But otherwise, this is a term which is fixed. Who is asking a slum dweller, okay, your settlement is in prime land. Okay. So just to kind of contrast it with in Thailand, there is the Ban Mekong scheme, and Ban Mekong also enables and organizes slum dwellers to even think about these choices, about where their land is located, what is its legal status, what will it cost to either improve it or make it legal, or if we shift and to a different place and to make all of these choices. You see it in Mumbai case, we are not giving these choices. Okay. There is no attempt to create awareness. There is no attempt to educate. Okay. One of the recommendations and something that we were working actively when we did the SRA study in 2001, I told you. So for a brief window, there was a CEO who was very good. So one of the things that we were working on is to actually create models. How would the entire layout look? How would a tenement look? And so that people are able to give inputs. Okay. And he had almost signed on the paper to make it and recommend it as a GR. It was transferred. So, so I think there are differences in the so redevelopment of culture definitely is there, right? Like in the city today, for any people coming from any class, you don't look at buying a house. You look at capitalizing on what you have. बाकी लोगों का उसमें क्या होता है, we don't care.
One of the literature that you mentioned in the first slide was Anandan Radamesh's piece on housing in the urban age, which is actually a conference that they attended, and it was a essay written out about that. And they cast it as a progressive moment. But from that moment, the Afzalpur Committee report, which had these three principles essentially, one is consent most importantly, but also the fact that people will get houses on the same site, and that the conditions will improve. So consent, conditions, and location. These were the three essentially progressive ideas of slum rehabilitation. But since that moment, every modification of the rules and norms have been a diminution of those. There are offshoots of the slum rehabilitation scheme which are which no longer require slum dwellers to be rehabilitated on site. There are dilutions in bylaws which architecture students will be interested in, which reduce the kind of quality of life and conditions and so on. So in terms of what it has meant, because Anandan Radamesha really foreground the housing rights struggle as the SRA in a way a kind of a negotiated victory of housing. How do you see the housing rights struggle and its and how it has changed and transformed since that moment till today, where the way you describe it, redevelopment is almost a raging on.
Great question as well. What were housing rights struggles earlier in the city? I think some of the strongest struggles ever to be seen in the country were in Mumbai and Kolkata. I think even the SRA scheme, while Anand may be arguing that this is really a culmination in some ways of housing rights struggles, I think at that point itself, the contradictions in this had started emerging. And so you basically see that there were particular representatives who were present in the Afzalpur committee. So it is not it was never a demand of the housing rights struggles that they wanted a free house. I don't remember a single struggle, I remember, which has demanded that they wanted a free house. That they wanted secure housing, yes. That they wanted tenure, yes. Or housing or services. No, I've never heard of free house, right? So firstly, to talk about this as the culmination, okay, but to be taken with a load of salt, not a pinch of salt. But what it has done to housing rights struggles, not this alone, but subsequently is, I think, very telling. Even during the development plan, when there were discussions across several housing activists, it was almost like one could not go back to a imagination of a city where there could be a right to occupy which could be asserted. That has just flown out of the imagination. So you will still need to think now only of redevelopment, but widening the options of that. Um, Making perhaps a little more choices which are possible. If you look at the contours of housing struggles today, they are so limited. They are very area based. You do not see intercity, uh, intracity, I will say, across the city. So in 2004-5, when there were massive evictions in different parts of the city, there was some resurgence, and which stayed on for about 3 to 4 years, very, very actively. And I think that has also been dissipated, basically because what the SRA regime has been able to do is to fragment all of this. Okay, I remember one instance which was so shocking for me. Some of my students were doing fieldwork in a settlement in Yogeshwari. It's still Prerna. And as I got down at the bus stop, right next to the bus stop, there was an eviction in progress. And I was coming to this part of the Premnagar for the first time. So there was someone from the settlement who was going to meet me at the bus stop. Okay? And she was there. So we started walking. I said, "Kamma na baka काय चालू आहे?" And the response was, "काही लक्ष नका ना देऊ हे हे 95च्या नंतरचे." Okay? So no need to pay attention. Okay? Now just think about this. Today, everyone is aware of this kind of factions. Okay? Another small instance which I will give. In 2011, PISS carried out a very big survey in East Ward, where we tried to actually survey each and every household which stays in informal settlements. Okay? Now, very interestingly, all the surveyors were denied access to those who stayed on the first floor. So this is like the first clear exclusion. Yeah, survey doesn't talk about all households in the store. There is this line, and this is the dynamic which is happening within. So now housing struggles are this locality based, interest based. That is how you're seeing things.
So we have students, we have 10 minutes. Anyone has questions? One sec, first, in case some students have. Pranav, you also wait. Okay, students sitting online, maybe you can unmute and ask. Okay, Shravan, go ahead. So when we look at alternatives proposed to the system that we currently have, were there any proposed when the system was initially sort of decided on, if there was a choice between them, or have there been alternatives proposed that's either a revamp of the system or a completely different system? What are the current alternatives being proposed? Both, like in the some sense, like what have the proposals been to replace the SRA or alternatives to it?
Experimentation. Experimentation, slum rehabilitation or redevelopment itself was a small stream. Okay? What was the larger reality? The larger reality was of improvement schemes, of upgradation programs, which were subsequently declared as a failure. Okay? But this was the reality, and some provision of services, and within which redevelopment came up as an option. Okay? It was not being thought of as a law. When did options start getting closed? Its first closure was with when redevelopment was introduced as part of the slum law. Okay, and it negated options. Okay, all over the country, you will see there are multiple options clearly which are being experimented. So if you think about Odisha, I think Odisha today is a great example of what it means to improve the entire habitat. They have given property rights to all the slum dwellers. all slum dwellers across all the towns and cities of Odisha. Not only that, they have formed slum dweller associations there, with whose help they have also try to improve the entire environment, including introducing new facilities like rainwater harvesting systems, like open spaces and community space development, street lights. Okay, so taking and bringing all of this up to a level where the difference between the rest of the town and the settlement would be minimized. Okay. Now, this level of habitat development has not happened in all cities and towns, but where it has happened, for example, in Puri, where some of the first programs have been done, it's fantastic. So within the country, there are examples. Okay. But there are also examples which are going the other way. In Ahmedabad, as I said, there are two simultaneous movements that I see. So one is a option where lands which were occupied under the Alkara by informal settlers, they have been given property rights to that. I think this is fantastic. Mumbai, this has not been done. If you look at the entire Ghatkopar, Vikhroli, Mulund, the entire absolutely. They have all slums which are located on private lands. So that's fun. Right? If they could have been given property rights instead of subjecting them to the violence and building such dense buildings on hill slopes, it could have been avoided, right? There are some positive signs, like in the development plan, after much argument, there is one sentence. And that one sentence says, you can also experiment with upgradation and other forms of improvement. This remains completely muted. Okay? In a state in which you see after COVID, especially, when the government is clearly determined, its economic revival is going to be fully contingent on real estate development. There is no way in which you can see an option. So Mumbai और मुंबई के slums ये बकरा है.
Right. So when you look at like geologically sensitive areas and there are slums which are very close to the base of it. So if a structure like for example Gilbert Hills, which is in Ability, if it gets, there are many parties which are contesting it to become a grade 1 heritage structure. When it does that, there are like certain rules about building under this. When that happens, like how do you like people have to be removed. So how do you like deal with them?
I will not give you answer to this, a direct answer. What I pose to you is more questions. Okay? Mumbai itself is full of hills and dips. Right? So when you think about Gilbert Hill, there is also Malabar Hill, Pani Hill. Yes or no? Who stays there? Stays there. Okay. So I think it's very interesting to see. So we've done one small study, and I'll be happy to share the report over the mail. Where we looked at landslides, and especially after 2 years ago, there were several people who died in Sahyadri Nagar in Chitpur. So we conducted a small study consulting people about what is to be done. So very interestingly, what the government talks about is when somebody dies, the quick response is we will rehabilitate for them. And they will be part of project affected community and they will be part of some redevelopment. We have seen that this has not ever solved the problem. Reason, there are two. Number one, in this city, where each of these spaces, because the poor are looking for some option to stay. Those are thinner, right? So when there is one set of families which gets shifted to a redevelopment option, there is another set of vulnerables who takes their place. And they remain unserved. Okay? So you will not believe that we have never thought about also what can be done on hillsides. Okay? In Sahyadri Nagar, we saw that for pregnant women, okay, they have to take a dolly and walk 4 kilometers down. Okay? To fill water, women every day have to do a trek of 1.5 kilometers. Okay? Solid waste. There are no arrangements. Solid waste and the which gets accumulated, and because the only response that BMC and other authorities have, key landslide, build retention wall. Okay? Funnily, maintenance of retention wall is not the responsibility of anybody. Anybody. Okay? So when I talked about this application of state, now this is very real. Ki actual jo slum habitats hai, we don't invest in the living habitat because for us, their future is redevelopment. Ignore how they are living just now. If you look at Brazil or Rio, Rio all has its settlements up on the hillsides. They have today ensured that they are reached through cables. There are forms of mobility, whether it is the same thing, but we have never thought about it. So slums as living habitats is complete, and so we are not trying to solve the problem. I think when you ask me the question of what can be done, it is only from the point of view of geological security. I'm telling you that geological security or safety is not the only consideration that one needs to have. There have to be other parameters. And if geological safety can be assured for Pali Hill and Malabar Hill, I'm sure there are other ways in which we can think about these settlements.
Yeah, I'll anyway take a separate appointment with her and chat for 2 hours. But thanks, great lecture. But I just wanted to add that the reason why I came for the lecture, which I think was not sufficiently covered, was the structural violence. And I think what's been happening with the slums over the past 30 years is, I mean, it's unprecedented, I think. In fact, I would liken it to something like the Myanmar military junta. This is at that level, the violence has been ingrained. Two things, abdication, when you say it is not really abdication, it's completely redefining the state. And that redefinition of the state has actually happened also with the complete acquiescence of the educated and elite middle and upper middle class. Everybody sitting over here, affording an education over here is equally a party of it. I think post-liberalization, the urban middle class has just completely abdicated involvement with governance, which is also seen, and before you came, Nitin bhai, we were all chatting over here that nobody, I mean, I'm not active in activism since 5 years now. The violence is something which is faced by us in the civil society as activists also, because there has been zero support from the middle class. If I sit with my own family members, friends, etc., and try to live a mainstream life, that's a completely different life. There's no conversation on these things over there at all. So I think we'll sit separately, but there's a separate, longer conversation on the nuts and bolts. We haven't still got onto the MLAs. All the 36 MLAs of Mumbai are developers. Everybody's net worth starts from 100 crores onwards. 100 crores is the base. JVLR, Ravindra Vaikar, has become even Minister of Housing. Let's not get into what all JVLR is. So, I mean, there's a huge amount of discussion on this. So you respond.
agree with you that the extent of the nexuses that we are talking about are huge.
Mayanagari is able to put a Bollywood sheen over it, but it's Myanmar military junta which is operating. Nothing less than. There's no mother of democracy in which democracy is.
So I just have a doubt. In your initial presentation, you mentioned that the SRA scheme created a certain kind of commodification of land on which slums grew. And in the end, we also spoke about the Odisha model, they're giving property rights as a solution. So what differentiates one being violent and the other being a model? No?
No, I agree with you that the property rights, even in Odisha, would be a form of commodification, right? But on the other hand, if you look at what is the state there, what is the role of the state, okay, there also there are limitations of the state, huh? And that is interesting because this is a state which does not have the scale of resources that the Maharashtra government has. So it has been completely dependent on civil society to deliver. Okay? So Tata Trust kahin pe, Janagrah kahin pe, or other organizations, BMGF. So all of those are the faces of the state. Okay? But I would say that comes across as a much more softer version. The state has invested in creating slum dwellers associations, in encouraging those. If you look at what is the movement within SRS, the state has actively worked to scuttle voice. So there are multiple elements of this which are, I think, there. And I completely accept your point that yes, this is also a kind of commodification, a different level perhaps. But SRS is not just commodification. SRS is changing and taking that commodification to a different level and then calling it free. Okay? In fact, in some ways, one is calling and saying that this slum household and this house that you have created, it doesn't have any value. You see, you're devaluing that. So there is a commodified market within which you are devalued. So what is your navigating space?
Okay. Yeah. So in Mumbai, we see that there is a body of for development planning which is been planned, and then there is a body of SRA which documents the some settlements. So there's like two different organizations which do this job, and then when it's to be done on the ground reality, what happens is there is a patch of land being reserved for different purposes on the ground, and where there are existing slums being reliving. So what do you see that we see that there is no collaboration between these two major bodies itself, the one development planning organization and then SRA organization, though they map everything down there. So how do you think that collaboration can be?
Okay. I think it's well documented, and I'm not an architect, but I think perhaps it's well documented that whatever the 1991 plan stated, 1991 development plan stated, was all done, undone, rather, by the development control regulations, of which SR developments were a major part. Okay? So it is not only that there is no coordination, but I think there are two other questions that you need to ask, okay, besides coordination. In case of non-coordination, which authority is given precedence? Okay, because that is what matters, right, in some ways. And secondly, how are these proposals processed in order to also ensure that there is coordination? So a typical government way of working and ensuring coordination is to ensure that any paper for approval moves from X to Y to Z if it wants. You clearly see when you create SRA as a separate authority, you're trying to give it much more importance than anything else. Anything else. So I think we should not be talking about coordination here, but rather we should be talking about which document, which department has to first have the primacy. Are we wedded and committed to the idea of enforcing a development plan? Or are we committed to the idea of development doesn't require planning? It is basically a facilitation of wherever, whatever developers can construct, wherever they find feasible, what results is developed. That is what is being produced, right?
Okay, with that, I think we have to close now. Thank you very much, Amita, for coming and talking to students and answering questions. If you guys have more questions, you can always write to Amita. Her email address is amita@tiss.edu. And so you can write to her, and obviously also take an appointment at me whenever you want to. But we will try to call Amita again whenever we get an opportunity. So thank you very much for coming. Thank you, Amita.
You have to fill the